Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. So these talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, which is now, both here in the building and live online. Hello, online folks. So whether you're in Bristol or you're far away, you can join in the conversation. So now, my name is Martin O'Leary. I am the studio community lead here at the Pervasive Media Studio. I'm a white man in my 40s with long hair and a beard wearing an orange t-shirt today. Every Friday, we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend some time in our space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So especially big welcome to anyone who's new to the studio. Can anyone who's new to the studio put their hand up? Oh, quite the crowd today. Welcome. This is all for you. Ellie, you brought your friends.
Yeah.
So this bit's for you. What is the Pervasive Media Studio? We're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology, everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. I've said that so many times. We're a partnership between Watershed, where we are right now, UE Bristol and the University of Bristol, and we're funded by Arts Council England. And we offer studio space, including desks, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, all for free to our residents as part of a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. And we're a space for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and to make some time for collaboration. So just a few notes before we begin. Please do feel free to move around. There's a kitchen back there behind you. You can grab tea or coffee, glass of water, milk is in the fridge. We have a quiet space just next to this space to my left, to your right. So if you need to take a break at any point, you can pop in there. It is well soundproofed. There are fire exits at either end of the studio. We are not expecting a fire drill today. If you hear a fire alarm, that's probably real. The studio team will direct you towards the fire exits, but in any event, they are at the other side of the studio. Again, my left, your right, at either end. They're pretty obvious, to be honest. And there are accessible toilets, including baby change. Again, no babies for, like the 50th week running, but one of these days there's going to be a baby here. We have had babies, yeah. Okay. I mean, I haven't personally had babies, but collectively, the babies have been here. There are accessible toilets, including baby change, in the corridor over there next to the kitchen. All right, there'll be a Q&A at the end of the talk. Those of you who are watching online, you can pop your questions into the YouTube chat. Tony will be your voice in the room today. If you're in the building, raise your hand and we'll send a microphone around so the folks at home can hear what you're saying. You can get news on all of our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at PM Studio UK on Twitter, at Pervasive Media Studio at mastodon.social on Mastodon, or at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. I will also flag that we are currently pushing our makeshift camp, which is happening this August. So if you are aged 18 to 30 and interested in making fun, playful things with technology, check that out. It's on the website. We'll pay you to come here and do something fun. Or we'll put you in a pot and, pick some people. We can't pay everyone. All right, our speaker for today is Elinor Lower. Ellie is a writer, theatre maker, and studio resident whose work wrestles with and celebrates text, archive, risk, tenderness, environment, control, and joy, all at once. Today they're going to talk about their in-progress work, We Meet in the Woods, an interactive theatre game exploring collective storytelling and more than human intelligences. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Ellie.
Hello. Hello, my name's Ellie. As Martin said, I'm a writer and theatre maker, and I work across both kind of live and non-live art forms, all sort of orbiting various forms of performance. I sort of describe myself a little bit as like a hoarder of disciplines and skills, because I think there's something really fun about like magpieing bits and pieces from what everybody else does and sort of bodging it together into something, I don't know, like a smorgasbord of something that kind of covers sound design and stage management and improv comedy and, I don't know, building contraptions that you can hang from a lighting rig or something like that for a teenager to play with. I'm really interested in the kind of those collision points and that sort of friction that emerges when you sort of slam various different things together. I've been making work in earnest for probably about 6 years, so I would describe myself as kind of confidently early career. And with that in mind, I've got quite comprehensive notes on my computer, so if I'm giving it too much to this, that's why. But I'll try as much as possible to not just give the entire talk to my computer. So for this talk, I'd love to take you through my kind of the practice that I'm coming from in exploring this game, the kind of the project and the residency that brought me to this studio, We Meet in the Woods, and my sort of early attempts at untangling player agency and the kind of complications I found in the project in doing that, and kind of the ways in which like you open one door and then there's 16 more doors, and then you open one of those doors and there's 35 more doors, and the way that projects, in my experience so far like this, kind of have this kind of amazing multiplicitous potential to just keep going and going and going, and the work is kind of in narrowing down rather than necessarily letting them sprawl out. And then the kind of the connections that I'm drawing between this project and its early kind of nascent form and my sort of wider collaborative process and practice making devised theatre work with young people, because I think there's something really interesting in the kind of processes of co-creation that we use when we're making participatory or collaborative work that could potentially be a really interesting route into making immersive or experiential work in which the audience is afforded a degree of agency. That's quite a lot of stuff. Does that sound okay? This is gonna be our first choice moment. Yes or no? Does that sound okay? Great. I suppose we're good to keep going, but like ultimately, I'm going to keep talking, and the choice that you have is that you stay or if you decide to leave. So please don't leave. So to start off with, a lot of the work that I make explores making sort of formally experimental work with young people. So often it'll be getting a group of teenagers, often they're sort of about 14 to 19 years old, to kind of pitch ideas, build a cast of their own, maybe direct it themselves, and kind of with the only caveat that it be formally experimental, that it kind of push themselves or each other or some ideas or something they've been thinking about in some kind of way towards making something new and unlike anything they've ever seen before. So in 2019, working at the Bristol Old Vic with some of the people from their young company, we ran a project called Young Ferment, which was basically for young people to scratch some new work. And I just want to show you a couple of the things that we made as part of that, because I think some of the ideas that came out of that were really interesting. So in that first year, the young people made work about language-rooted totalitarianism, where they blended Old English, Latin, and modern English to kind of striate a dystopian future present. They made a dance show about the present-day echoes of colonial criminalization of homosexuality. They made a collage of vignettes inspired by Kay Tempest's work, Let Them Eat Chaos, that were all about teenage loneliness. And they made a participatory work that invited the audience to explore what it means to admit that you were wrong. And I'm going to come back to that one. In 2022, we went on to do the same project again, obviously in a kind of a drastically different context. We'd had a pandemic in that time. They'd been through a lot as young people. And in that intervening period, I'd taken a bit of a wander around more environmental sort of stuff. I'd made a sound work exploring what it might mean to sublimate human noise into a noise of a sea soundscape. And I'd collaborated on an R&D that was exploring the kind of creeping eco-fascism that can kind of emerge in green and pleasant land environmentalism. And both of these are kind of touchstones that really informed the way that I was thinking about We Meet in the Woods, when I was thinking about what it means to disappear the human into a landscape, and what it means to look really closely at an environment that we love, that we think we really care about, and that figures quite large in our kind of collective national imagination, meaning kind of, I suppose, British imagination, without letting it be that sort of like, this is our land, our, the blood is in the earth, that sort of Arcadia, sort of weird Poole, King's North, fascist vibe. So how we can kind of go this way without going into a strange far right thing, which seems to happen quite a lot of the time when people start talking about how nice the countryside is. So yes, when we returned in 2022, the young people made work about gentrification. They made work about the typecasting of young black men in media. They made work about what it means to die. And they made work about whether it's possible to be actually creative under capitalism, which I'll be honest was a little bit too real and was challenging to work through. So all of these works emerged from initial workshops with self-selecting members of the young company, individuals pitched ideas and concepts. We kind of assembled cast based on who was interested in particular things, and then over several months of weekly sessions making material and interrogating text and keeping some and discarding some of it, we kind of eventually evolved towards having something like a show that we could share with the public. For those of you who've worked on devised processes, and I know a bunch of you here, you'll know that that's how it goes, that it is this process of like slowly together, incremental gains, making, until you have something that feels like it's closer to what you were aiming for. And it's this process of making devised theatre with a group of young people with kind of varying levels of comfort and experience around performance, this kind of different relationships towards taking risk and experimenting with form, that kind of provides a foundation for this sort of methodology that I'm interested in teasing out in terms of like audience participation in immersive or participatory work. So the project and the residency that brought me to the studio. From February to March of this year, I was one of the Winter Residency artists, which basically means I had 11 funded days to spend a bit of time thinking about something under the umbrella of other minds. And the other minds that I was interested in exploring was specifically forest intelligence and the ways that forests kind of innately, I suppose, use their form of intelligence looped in with mycelial networks and the kind of the various creatures and forms of life that inhabit those spaces, how they self-organize, distribute resources, distribute information, how one tree that's not able to access the canopy is still fed with the amount of energy that they need by the ones that can. There's no difference in the, let's not go down too much of a route, but there's no difference of the amount of like glucose, for example, that's inside a tree that can't actually reach the top because its mate next door that's got a top floor apartment is like, have some of this, get a bit of this glucose. And the ways that kind of happens because it's an ecosystem that is self-supporting and self-sustaining. There is something that feels kind of vaguely fraudulent in talking about this project in any kind of massive terms because it is so embryonic. I've kind of had these 11 days to bodge some stuff together. And it sort of doesn't really exist yet, but I think I personally really enjoy that moment of like, you've made all the stuff and then you stand back and you look at the wall of Post-it notes and you go, is that anything? Is this, what am I doing? And I thought that maybe it would be relatively interesting to do that with all of you here. So you're now participating in that process of sorting through. So yeah, my interest in the project was and is kind of twofold. I'm kind of interested in developing a compelling narrative that offers an imaginative space for audiences to fall into step with the more than human world around them, and in a way that is crucially fun and silly and rooted in kind of going out into a space and mucking around a little bit, but also to use this form of a piece of interactive work to explore or play through or enact these kind of mutualist ways that forest ecosystems self-organize. And I suppose chiefly I'm interested in exploring the possible narrative answers to the question, what might it mean to fall into step with the environments around us, specifically forests, but also I suppose other things as well. And that is an evolved question from my original point of inquiry, which I might touch on later, but I'm not going to dwell on right now. So the narrative of the game as it stands is rooted really heavily in communication and in what it means to speak and to listen and that kind of reciprocal exchange. So you, the player, are a radio tower operator on the edge of a kind of series of mesas, those kind of those landforms and there'll be like a flat land and then there'll be like a thing that rises up out of the flat land. So imagining a sort of an environment where there's a bunch of those. And on each one, and connecting each one, there's like a network of bridges that are typically held up, but can be lowered down when someone needs to come in and out. And on the flat land below, there is this forest, but getting down there is really difficult. No one's been down there that you, the player, know for maybe a decade, maybe two, maybe more. You are a shift worker, and you share your shift with a friend, but you don't really kind of cross paths in any way, and it's a really kind of key part, I think, of the narrative as it stands, that this is about a character who is isolate at the beginning of the narrative. Within the world of the story, you have been attempting for months and months and months to find out what is going on with your radio system. There is something wrong with the radio system. There is this intermittent hiss that is pushing through, that is interrupting, making it very difficult to hear what the people on the other side are saying, what those people in the distance are saying. Maybe there's a disaster and you can't hear what's going on quite as closely as you would like to, and there's this complication of communication. And then one night, which is the moment at which the game begins, this hiss disappears. And there is this moment of sudden kind of like crystalline clarity, where you hear a voice coming in over the radio that is something that is transmitting in from out there. Graphic design is my passion. I hope you like my drawings that I've made. I made it myself. So the first part of this story, so that narrative up until this point is played through as a kind of a choose-your-own-adventure style solo game, which, as I imagine it at the moment, is something that is sent towards the player to play it on by themselves. Either, it's in the hour before you come and actually play the game in person, or it's the week before or whatever. But it's basically an opportunity for the character to kind of feel out the boundaries of the story world, maybe make some narrative choices, pick some characteristics for their character to have. And at the moment, those choices don't affect the later plot of the game, but that just purely because it was 11 days and I don't know how to do that. But it is something that I would love to weave in later should the opportunity present itself. So once this kind of mini game is completed, departing from this kind of isolate point, there's an invitation for the player to continue stepping forwards, sort of tracing this transmission back to its source and tuning into something that sort of expands and complicates as they go. As each player moves through the story, the mechanics and the narrative, working in tandem, kind of collide the individual with other players. So if we imagine that this is you've done your little choose-your-own-adventure bit, you have a couple of moments of exploring the environment, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, and then at a certain point, the game will drive you towards another player, at which point the complication begins. You two will kind of travel along for a little while in the game together, and this is simultaneously happening with everybody else as well. And then the 2 will become a 4, the 4 will become an 8, or however many players there are in the game, so that at every decision point, the process of deciding what will happen becomes a little bit more complicated. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that kind of choice and that process is, and the ways in which I'm starting to unravel it a little bit in a moment. So yes, before this colliding happens, there's an invitation for the player guided through the perspective of the character they're playing, because I think in the experiments that I've done as part of the narrative, it's been really interesting and useful, I suppose, in the way that a lot of immersive work will give you a mask or give you a role to play or a character or something that distances you a little bit from the you of the present moment and lets you kind of play in a narrative space a little bit more. You get this perspective of the character that you're playing at as to spend a little bit of time interacting with your environment, doing what I'm calling getting over the hurdle of how embarrassing this all is. Because I think there's a lot to be said for being brave and meeting strangers and doing a thing where you're all collided together, but also, I don't know about you, but the prospect of spending an hour doing a load of teamwork with some strangers does sort of make me feel a little bit ill. And even if it's silly and lighthearted, I think there's something really useful in giving people an on-ramp to going, okay, what does it mean to put my fingers in the soil? Is anybody watching? I feel like I'm on CCTV. This feels cringe. But that if this game is about connecting to and falling into step with environment, I think it is important that we are able to be tactile in a space. And so I think that moment of play is useful. I'm also interested in how sort of tactile technology. So I explored making a printer that not like this, but you could mount on a tree or whatever, and you could press it and it feeds out something like a fun thing to do, or that you might walk past something and it triggers some lights, ways that tactile technologies might sort of ease that connection with the environment around us. Because, for whatever point, I don't want the game to feel like it's getting too far away from this is silly and being human's not that deep. It doesn't need to get too kind of esoteric too quickly. So part of the inspiration for We Meet in the Woods was a series of intervention works that were made by the artist Daphne Ackerman, who's a French artist who does a lot of stuff with intervening or reconfiguring our relationships with the environment around us. So she does a lot through small physical acts. For example, burying like your knee in the soil and then setting a timer and sitting there for like 30 minutes and being like, what does it feel like to have buried my knee in the soil? Those sort of things where like when you talk about them in the pub with your friends, you're like, is that bullshit? But it feels really cool and interesting to do at the time. So things like that. Digging a hole in the ground and then doing a headstand. This is my friend Yuno doing it really, really well. That is me doing it not as well. I thought I'd got my legs so straight. I was like, I've smashed this. I look amazing. And they showed me the photos and I was like, delete that. And then here we are putting it on a big screen. Or there's some other interventions which I think I'm really interested in this context, which is getting a group of people to gather around a part of an environment. In this case, we were trespassing on a building site in Mannheim in Germany, and collectively going, this reminds me of the surface of the planet Mars, or it could be a series of mesas where these are kind of the lands, but there's these gaps in between, or this is the skin of a giant. Sort of collectively together, looking at something and being like, how can we reinterpret this? How can we imbue it with a little bit of magic? And letting that be a sort of like claiming of agency over a space, particularly in this case where it was literally a building site on a Sunday, so the builders weren't there, and just feeling like the environment was somewhere we were allowed to be and allowed to play. And I think, there's a duty of care that's owed to people who will come and play your thing, that will come and do this kind of quite vulnerable, silly activity. So it's important to kind of give people this on-ramp to click into gear, I guess, is the way that I'm thinking about it. So once that hurdle of embarrassment has been cleared, the next kind of potential obstacle for player participation rears its head, which is the first time that players are collided with each other. Anyone here a huge fan of a conversation with a stranger? Do we love to have a conversation with a stranger? No. Then perfect for you, love that. Most people makes me sick in my mouth, I hate that. So I think over the course of the residency, I did various experiments, which was basically like, what could this moment of meeting be? You are two people who have been mucking around, you've got, you're covered in mud, you've sat on the floor maybe a little bit, you're feeling slightly more confident about your role in the space. And then you need to tune in and talk to another person. What does that feel like? And over various experiments I did where I invited friends to complete tasks together, to people that didn't know, to kind of come together and just like chat about a narrative or something like that. What became super clear was that the overwhelming feedback was that putting two people together and like not giving them any parameters or guardrails was that they would just choose to not do anything, and they would just choose to be like, oh, it's a nice day, isn't it? Yes, it is a nice day. Did you get the train here? No, I walked. Did you get the train? No, I don't know why I asked that question. It was a lot of like that sort of very awkward conversations. And so if the game requires that people meet and quickly form enough of a bond, even if the goal is that people freewheel and they have agency and they do whatever they want, that it's not fair to ask people to just like completely innovate a new mode of conversation in a new environment. So at the sharing back in March, having done all of that experimentation, some people were very kind to test out an idea that I'd had, which was that perhaps a script might support people to speak to each other, allow them to kind of duck behind the character that they're playing, but also to express some, maybe to be a bit vulnerable with each other, but in a way that like feels, because you're holding a piece of paper, silly and kind of like, oh, this is a bit, you can kind of point at the thing. It's not about this bond, it's about this. And so you can kind of slightly redirect that embarrassment that might rear its head. The script included moments such as this, which I will read out just for anybody that needs it. Where B says, I was quite nervous before this all started. Oh, me too. I was worried I'd be paired with someone rude or mean. I was worried about that too. But you're not. You're wonderful, little compliment. I am wonderful. And you? Me? You're brilliant. The perfect partner. I guess I am. So we've done some like strange little compliment giving. There's like a later thing where people talk about how they feel about the thing. And while it is sort of putting words in people's mouths, there is something that's really, like they have the opportunity afterwards, once the script ends, to go, oh, I didn't actually mean that, or whatever. Like that opportunity exists, but I think there's something about making two people who have never met each other before say nice things to each other that I think is nice and interesting. So that's what I've done. The feedback from it generally was that it was kind of just gentle and silly enough that it did genuinely enable people who didn't know each other to form like a weird, quick little bond. People kind of came out of it being like, oh, that was a weird little experience we shared together. But it did, in the version that I tested in March, did sort of chuck people out at the end being like, off you go, make the first decision. Because that's the point at which after you do the script, it goes, okay, you two have met now, what next? Where do you want to go? And there was some really useful feedback from a lot of players who felt that like maybe they might have wanted to keep talking for a little bit more. Maybe they would have wanted to kind of have it be a slow pullback, that the script could maybe have gone, if you'd like to, you could ask each other some questions. Here are some questions you could ask each other that let people get beyond the kind of surface level of like, oh, we're here doing a weird like camp role play, but like, don't actually know who you are. This hasn't actually helped me get to know you. So that maybe there could be some questions like favourite things they like to do, or both of you have a look around the forest clearing and see if you can spot anything that you think is cool. Not those are rubbish, but interesting questions. So that's something that is a learning that I'm going to implement next. So I'm sure many people will know from having done their own R&Ds that there are periods of time in which ideas really do shift and change. They kind of get poked at by outside eyes and become more and more complicated. And because so many of the core ideas of this project stem from a desire to interrogate our kind of immediate kind of human, late-stage capitalist, neoliberal, whatever period of time that we're in, sort of patterns of behaviour, whilst also like being like, yay, silly, fun time. This has been a distinct process of like challenge for me to kind of untangle what my assumptions are about my relationship with language, with nature, my relationships with participatory art, with making, and with like who I am in a space when I'm in a forest, and whether I can and should try and copy and paste that onto an experience that somebody else might have. Like the first draft of this talk even had several mentions of like our forests and the land that we blah blah blah. And when I first pitched the project, I think the question was, what might forests want us to know? Because I was so excited about making this thing that might bring people together to be in the forest and to spend time with each other and feel these really big feelings and like be transformed by it and then go home and blah, 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 which I think is fine. But I think is inseamed with this quite sort of extractive approach to the world around us and what things can teach us, how things can give us value, how we can be we can glean things and be made better by it. And so this is the kind of one of the first hurdles that I've been trying to cross, is kind of like undoing that kind of like extractivity thing, and put it in a slightly more, I don't know, nebulous and uncertain space. Because I suppose if we take it as given that we humans are not the only intelligence on Earth, which we certainly aren't, and are certainly not the only intelligence in the universe, although I don't have the facts to back it up, but I just think it's statistically unlikely that we're alone in the universe. Don't need to go into aliens. Stay on task. What then might a narrative that kind of is embracing this complication, this multiplicity look like? How might it kind of complicate classic quest narratives where you go into the abyss in search of the lost amulet and you take it home? That kind of heart of darkness colonial journey. How might this not be that, and how might the way that it plays out invite that kind of complication, that multiplicity? Perhaps it could take cues from the ecology of the forest itself. Maybe chapters seed each other and they kind of like you drift through them in a way that's not necessarily kind of like a standard Western linear narrative. There's still cause and effect because, a seed falls, rain comes. It's either the right amount of rain or it isn't. Consequences, blah, blah, blah. But how might we elongate or compress timescales? How might we be prompted by deep time, nature time, things that aren't human, in order to kind of reconfigure our relationships with things? How might the game, to badly paraphrase the way that people talk about New York in Sex and the City, how might the forest, the place where it happens, be a character as well? Little speech bubble. Just a little bit of comedy for you there. So there's this question of agency, and there's this thing that I've not yet been able to fully untangle, that's still a bit kind of tricky about what it means to have given voice or to be trying to give voice to a forest, what that means when I'm not a forest. I don't have a mycelial map for a brain enabling the kind of transfer of information in my head. But that is one of those things that I'm kind of noodling on, and it'll come, one thing at a time. But for now, thinking distinctly about player agency and how telling a story about and with a place like a forest, which has been kind of flattened and mythologized, deforested and replanted in kind of monocrop neatness when you drive by the motorway and you see all of those lovely saplings growing in exactly the way that a person thinks that they should grow. What that might, whether a step towards complicating the narrative might be to begin with creating a space for the multiplicity of player journeys. For different modes of engagement and play, and for somebody to opt out of following any narrative at any point, or to turn against the game and try and kick it apart because they're like, this sucks, I want to do something else. And I'm excited by the possibility that the game progresses, having started in this very controlled, choose your own adventure kind of way, slowly in this kind of way when we're making devised theatre work with people, or if as we're kind of doing any kind of learning process, you kind of accumulate skills and knowledge as you go, how we might build a game process that through like looking around the space and observing what that might mean in terms of a story, or playing a little game with a printer or something like that, might slowly give the audience enough of a feeling of ownership and confidence that they feel able to kind of take control of the narrative and resist if it tries to take them in a direction they're not interested in going in. Because I think the initial form of the game was that of a fully choose your own adventure story, where this concept of expansion, a single player with a pair into a 4, into a 6, not into a 6. What's 2 times 4? 8. How that might just complicate collective decision making, how we might come together and go, okay, well, I want to go this way, which way do you want to go? Well, I want to go that way. Okay, that's interesting. Let's make a decision together. And I think that is interesting because you will get to practice kind of consensus building and collective decision making, but choice isn't agency. If we take agency to mean the ability to take action or to choose which action to take, just the option of going, do you want A or B, isn't really agency. And so kind of thinking about this now after the kind of period of time of the residency, I'm interested in cracking open a little bit more. It's something that's really clearly demonstrated in the Choose Your Own Adventure chapter of Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House, if anybody's read it, which is a memoir about being in an abusive relationship, where you can choose any route you want, but in the memoir, all routes ultimately antagonize the partner, because the choice isn't real. You, the reader, have no real agency within the form of the story. And any attempts to disobey the form, you just go, I'm not going to turn to page whatever, I'm just going to turn the page like a normal book, I'm going to go back to the original form of a normal book, throws up reminders. So you shouldn't be on this page, there's no way to get here from the choices given to you. And it does this really good delineation of how you do or don't have choice within choice-based narratives. You flipped here because you got sick of the cycle, you wanted to get out, you're smarter than me, but still you don't really have any choice over what happens next. And so if I'm thinking about the interdependency and agency and collective storytelling, that presents a complication. If choose your own adventure is the form that best demonstrates a lack of agency, what form enables the inverse? What form might a game blur into if it's designed to hand over control to its players? Because in reading Machado's chapter, you can't affect the narrative in the final published version of the story. The book exists, you hold the book, it is real, it has been finished. But you can choose to stop reading, you could rip the pages out, you could cut the words up and reorder them in the sentences that change the ending. In the real world, you do have the agency to, for want of a better word, mess shit up. And so like Daphne Ackerman's work, perhaps there's something fun and playful in slowly nudging open the door to illuminate all the kind of the tendrils of our agency that we have, but we don't actually use. In a way that, like, in making a piece of movement with a group of performers, and you're seeing everyone's kind of making lovely movement where they're like up on their feet and they're, wow, movement. And you're like, you are allowed to lie on the floor if you'd like to lie on the floor, or you could climb up on a table and look at what the room looks like from above. There are sometimes we are so used to tuning into these kind of assumed codes of behavior that actually an invitation to do something different. I've broken the slideshow, it's terrible news. good stuff, never mind. A reminder of the different modes of engagement that we have, that we can engage with, presents something interesting or different for us to try. I don't think I'm going to get that back, and I think that's fine. Is there any way I can... Is this the cable? No. It's working on my screen, but it's not working on here, so maybe I've accidentally unplugged it. It's very possible. What? It's not working on here. Maybe it's just off. It's like, shut up, stop talking about worms. Hey! Back to a photo of me. We're not going to do that one first. If you'll forgive me a little bit of theory, in his book, Beyond Immersive Theatre, Adam Alston talks about what he calls entrepreneurial participation as a mode for agency for audience members in immersive and interactive work. And what he means by entrepreneurial participation, I suppose, is what it sounds like, where the design of the experience, often one figured as like free roaming, where the audience can go anywhere and do anything. It rewards the entrepreneurship of the player. Use your savvy, your tolerance for risk, your curiosity and ability to break away from the herd, to go through the most doors and talk to the most actors and open the most drawers and do the most things. And then at the end of that, you are rewarded by the most rich and comprehensive understanding of the story world. You've had the best time out of everyone. And in the bar afterwards, you are going to give everybody else FOMO because they didn't go into that room with you. And so they don't know that secret little bit of information. But what if you're not able to, or up for, or interested in doing that? Is your experience of that kind of less branching thing somehow poorer? And I'm sure many makers that make work where it's kind of a free roaming environment would say, well, no, that's fine. That is a valid experience of the thing. And I think that certainly in terms of a making perspective, certainly is true. But I think it's really interesting how that creates a friction with what we think the point of immersive experiential work is. If you'll allow me to share a little anecdote by means of kind of explanation. I had a friend who went to go and see a piece of free roaming immersive work that was like very high budget, very impressive, but they were in the middle of a PMDD flare-up, so they were feeling very tired, very in a bad mood about everything, and they didn't really want to be there, but they were going with their friends and they'd spent 80 quid on their tickets. They were like, unfortunately, I have to go. And they got there and it started and they thought it was very amazing. And it was all very opulent and beautiful. And when they got into one of the rooms, they saw a bed and they were like, that's absolutely perfect. Oh, I'm going to have a nap. So they got into the bed and they had a nap. And after about 10 minutes, a performer came over and was like, hello, hi, are you okay? And they were like, yeah, I'm having a nap. And the person was like, okay, great, see you later, fine. They go back to having a nap. 10 minutes later, another performer comes over and says, are you fine? It's like, yeah, I've already said to somebody I'm having a nap. It's fine, don't worry about it. But they kind of that second time were like, oh, I maybe shouldn't be in here in this bed that somebody's built. I should move on and go somewhere else. They went into a different space and there was a tent and they thought, fantastic. It's very Goldilocks, this story. Fantastic, just right. And they got into this tent with all these lights and these, like if anyone's seen The Holiday, that little tent that Jude Law's kids have got in the, no, don't worry about it. It's like a very cute, warm space, and they had a nap. And this time when somebody came over, they actually asked them to move on. They asked them not to be sleeping in there because they didn't explain why, but they just said, sorry, can I just ask if you would just move on from this space? And I think it's really interesting. It's a really interesting problem because there's a question about whether it was because it was making the performers uncomfortable, whether it was making audience uncomfortable, whether it's just like, that's not what you're supposed to do in this space. But it does raise the question of like, if the tent and the bed are not meant to be laying down in, why is it there? If you don't want people to touch and interact with everything, why is it there? If you're looking at somebody going, you shouldn't be doing that, you should be going in the room and asking all the questions, what do we actually want from our audiences that are exploring these environments that we've built? What do we actually want them to be doing? And if we want them to follow a more restricted path, then we should tell them that. We should make that clearer. And I think I'm still mulling a lot of this stuff over in relation to this game, and I don't know that I think there's necessarily anything wrong with a game that wants people to run everywhere and look at everything, but I do wonder whether that sort of productive participation, that active co-creation of a story is the only form of engagement in this sort of work that we will accept. because we're in this kind of experience economy thing where the aesthetic product, the affect that is being created sort of lives within the player, and if the player decides that they want to create a different type of thing, I think you have to let them. I think you have to let them do that. And I'm not interested in making work that turns every player into a competitor on The Apprentice. But also, I do want them to do stuff. And so it becomes an interesting question for me in making this, of how do I not make this thing that I think is about collectivism and space and environment like a perfect demonstration of Margaret Thatcher's no such thing as society, everyone man for themselves, etc., etc. So, yeah, in collaborative devised theatre making, particularly making work with young people who've had limited experience, are things that are super useful, and there are people who make devised theatre in here, so apologies, this is going to be boring. Clear parameters, how long we have to make or do this, how long it needs to be, how we're going to approach each task, the how, the where, the why. The presentation of the tools available, the disciplines we might play with, the lamps we might tape coloured plastic to, you've got this and this and this, you can use it in these ways, or you can use it in a different way, a presentation of options, small tasks with a clear outcome and an understanding of why, and anything that's talked about kind of theoretically or conceptually given an immediate and tangible application. There is also working in groups alongside others so that you can see alternative ways of approaching a single idea and get a chance to see for real that there's no wrong way of doing something. Sharing things with each other reciprocally, which is like, I'll be vulnerable so you can be vulnerable too. And a demonstration that the thing is possible because it has been done by others before. You are not the first person to try this. Others have done it in this way. You can go towards or away from, or I don't know, some other orientation. You can do something completely different with it if you so wish. And there is also always the option to bin things off if they're not working and just go, oh, I'm tired, I want a tea break. Does anybody else want to go and stand outside and like stare directly into the sun because this is pissing me off? Which I think is characteristic of all good learning and making processes. And many of them start with the presentation of information and parameters, a stimulus, a suggestion of an end goal to shoot for, but the potential that you could go elsewhere if you wanted. And I think that you can join in with making this game if you want. If I am thinking about making this game as something where I think I'd like people to claim the narrative and move off in whatever way they want, those are the characteristics that I think are really useful to build into the narrative flow of certainly the early stages of the game. That bit in Zelda where it doesn't let you walk off until you've proven that you know how to use all of the different stuff, and then it's like, okay, you've done it. Now you can go outside and go and explore the world. Does anybody know the essay, The Theory of Loose Parts by Simon Nicholson? It's an essay about play. I think it's amazing. He is a painter and sculptor, but he wrote this essay about the way we design play environments for children, and I think it absolutely rocks. In the opening bit of the essay, he says, in any environment, both the degree of inventiveness and creativity and the possibility of discovery are directly proportional to the number and kind of variables in it. And he was talking specifically about the way that we design environment for play for children, where one of his kind of core things that he talks about is basically you should let children play on building sites. It's got the most variables, they'll have a great time, which I think is terrifying, but also probably true. And he was sort of arguing that children need environments that have a lot of loose variables, and that if you come to a place that's really structured and organized, then the architect and all of the planners have had all of the fun with their drawings and their concepts and all that kind of thing, and then the builders have had all of the fun with the things that used to build playgrounds, I don't know, the like asphalt and the whatever. They've had all the, we call it fun, it's labor, but like everyone's had the fun of doing the making and the physicality of all of that. And then the children get there to this finished place and all the fun's already been had. And while you can use your mind, if there's like a bunch of stuff lying around, then it gives you more things that you can pick up and play with and start to physically affect your environment. And I think that comes hugely into the kind of kickoff of a devised data process, where if you kind of have a series of disparate objects, the potential for imagination is immediately supported. So like a young person, or indeed anyone, you could say, there's blankets here, there's lights, there's a thing that makes noise, and then suddenly they're like, I'm going to put the blanket on my head, I'm going to turn all the lights off, and I'm going to scream as loudly as I can. And then we all look at that and go, and what does it mean? And I think that there's something about that that's not somebody being like, I would like to make a play that's about something like, and having to really articulate all of the thought first. I think there's something about that in kind of enabling any kind of creativity. If we want people to participate in the co-creation of a narrative within a playable game, there's the presentation of these component parts that they might use, because we play games together to break the ice in theatre making. We maybe do a couple of small tasks, we make some freeze frames, we do some stuff with sound, we slowly assemble week on week, we'll put like a layer of dialogue, we'll put transitions, we'll put tech, all of this sort of stuff, until eventually we've come together and we've made the thing, and the thing exists, and suddenly all the people who at the beginning were like, I don't really know if I know how to make a play, at the end are like screaming at you in a tech rehearsal because you said the music was going to be really loud, and it's not loud enough. Actually, it's not loud enough, it needs to be louder, and there's this feeling of like confidence and power that comes through the process of making and stacking and all of that stuff. So if we're thinking about like looseness and loose parts, and I am getting to the end, don't worry, I won't talk forever. There's something interesting about keeping it as live as possible, and something that I've been experimenting with is how the frame of the game itself might be live, because I know that while I want there to be the potential for people to kind of kick against and maybe break this game, that it's useful always to have something that you can hang on to. And so I've been thinking about a narrative track that might guide the audience through the space, and lead them through these kind of untanglings of myth and past and present and future and characters and beings. And I wasn't sure what mode that should take, so I was exploring maybe it was something to do with walkie-talkies. So on Troopers Hill, I did some experiments with some people where I kind of read out parts of the story and then presented options for people to play with through walkie-talkie, and then set them off on whatever they wanted to do. What's particular about a walkie-talkie is it is a piece of technology that implies reciprocity, because it's designed for call and response. It's designed for people to respond. And that meant that the people that I tested it with, they did a little bit of script extract, they got to know each other a little bit, and then they had this thing where they could just ask what they were supposed to do next, and so they did just ask what they were supposed to do next. They were going, I don't understand the question. Where am I supposed to go? I've forgotten what you said. And there was this kind of like reliance on the structure of the thing, which was interesting, but perhaps runs kind of contra to the thing that I was trying to do, which was for the group to then become almost like, ignore me, I'm not here, and kind of self-organize. Which presents the question, what then kind of technology would best enable that to not happen? And so I'm thinking now more about like radio headsets that just go one way, and then if you want opportunities for people to speak back, maybe you put a load of microphones in an environment that are broadcast through like a web of speakers. Maybe you essentially set up technology so that it only ever goes in one direction. So that once the if the players want to interrupt or change or complicate whatever the narrative is at the moment where they feel that urge, they can, but it's not constantly in their pocket the entire time. So they're kind of going, oh, I'm just going to check that I'm not doing this wrong. I'm just going to check that I'm not supposed to be doing something else. So yeah, and how we might sort of just like loosely, this is such a low res video I filmed on an iPhone 5, sorry guys. How we might just put like things like little wayfinding beacons in a space that suggest routes and paths and try and keep the narrative as light touch as possible. Sorry, my computer's frozen. Lol. Because there's these moments where they have had to make decisions together, and they will have been afforded the opportunity to change and shape the thing somehow throughout, but there might become this point where they decide that actually the narrative's taking them in a way that because of all the things they've done so far, they don't want to go down that route, they'd rather go in a different direction. And so then I think there's something really interesting in the players having a co-created element to the narrative, where they create a stake for themselves in the world that they're building, but then it raises a question, what if the game then tries to destroy or trouble or muddy this thing they've made, bring in outside threats? What if the microphones through which they've been communicating are suddenly switched off? What happens if that agency is suddenly taken away from them? What do they do? I think that's interesting. As a final closing thing, when we did Young Ferment for the first time, one of the ideas that was proposed by young people was a thing about It was basically centering their perception that the adults in their lives were absolutely incapable of admitting that they were wrong at any time. They wanted to make a piece of theatre that investigated failure and impossibility and knowing your limits and embarrassment, because they identified that, to their mind, that the key hurdle to their parents admitting that they were wrong was pride. And so the process of making the show was really difficult because we only had access to theatre people when we were testing it. And theatre people are not a good simulacrum for normal people because they're too up for it and they will just throw themselves into... Like, we went downstairs and went, Toby, will you come and test something? And he just straight away was like in it like that. And I was like, not helpful, actually. This isn't helpful. That's not going to happen in the actual thing. But and I can't remember all of the tasks that were presented to the audience, but it basically was like, who thinks that they're good at this thing? And then the person would get up and they would demonstrate how they thought that they were good at that thing. And then the mini game would kind of kick in and it would essentially be designed to prove that that person was wrong. They're not actually good at that thing. And there was this amazing, really big red button that they were supposed to press when they accepted that they were wrong. And examples were things like who's really good at general knowledge, where all of the questions were delivered so fast you can possibly hear what was being said. Who's good at dancing, where you had to jump into a very tightly choreographed dance routine with them. Who's good in a crisis, where all of the actors then started trying to brutally murder one of the other ones, and you were just given a Nerf gun, but you weren't allowed to touch the young people because that's a safeguarding problem. And it was basically who can do this, who can do this, who can do this? And there was a huge amount of this could go wrong, this could completely fall apart. And what was really interesting was that more and more the audience really wanted to break the game. They wanted to prove that, no, they can do it, they can win, they can do this thing. And so then the rehearsal process became about building in all of these ways. You go, the breaking could happen in this way. Okay, how much breaking can the game take? What's a level of stress that the narrative will tolerate before the show is bad and it collapses? And what was really interesting about that was that question of that, what if, and how it meant that a 14-year-old has to get really good at improvising. They have to have an exit ramp. We have to know that at a certain point someone will intervene if it gets too far away from the thing that we were talking about in the first place. And similarly with the game, I'm really interested in exploring not necessarily preventing from doing things, but what is the limitation and what are those moments of friction? If you're trying to push against, you've built this lovely world for yourself, and then the narrative tells you that something's arrived that's going to destroy that lovely world that you've made. And you, up until this point, have gone, oh, well, we can just change it because we can speak to the live person who's doing the narrative over a microphone and go, oh, actually, we don't think that happens. And the narrative goes, okay, great, yeah, great. What happens is, it's like Dungeons and Dragons. Actually, that doesn't happen. What happens if that microphone switches off? What does that mean? You decide that actually you don't want to engage in this group thing anymore. You want to have a lie down and just enjoy the sun because it's really nice. You'd prefer to do that. What is the little moment of friction that marks the decision, that marks you go, okay, that's fine, you are allowed to do that, but does something happen that marks the fact that you've exited the space? And I think in terms of accessibility, it's really interesting because I don't want to create something where people feel that they cannot advocate for their own needs in something, but equally, like with this, I think there's something really interesting in discomfort and slamming a bunch of people together to do something uncomfortable, like embarrass themselves in a forest, not embarrass, but do something a bit cringe in a forest, speak to a stranger, co-create a story, and that within that there will be a little bit of discomfort. As I'm sure you can tell, it's all a work in progress. It's a lot of questions, there's fewer answers than there are questions. Nevertheless, onwards. Thanks for being part of the brain drain with me. You're all amazing. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you very much, Ellie. We've got time for a couple of questions. If anyone has any, anyone want to stick their hand up?
Hi.
Yeah, it's not, yeah, yes.
Okay. I was just wondering, so getting over that cringe moment,
Yes.
Have you ever thought of using music to sort of try and enhance the group feeling and get over the sort of awkwardness of being in a group? Because I know music can be incredibly powerful, especially when it's just like a drum or something that can...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I haven't actually thought about music in that kind of that group meeting moment, but I think that's a really good point because it's one of those things that does just really take the edge off of space.
Yeah.
If you're all stood there in total silence. Really, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah, something that supports the space around you rather than it being
Yeah.
what do you do? Yeah, nice one. Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I think sound, I would like to play a really huge part of this because I think it's a really good environment builder. So yes is the answer to the question.
Cool.
Any other questions?
Hello.
Hello.
What is next for you onwards?
Onwards. So the next part of it is developing this audio narrative. So I'm working with a couple of actors to workshop some little bits of plot, because my hope is basically that there is a through line that runs from beginning to end, and if the audience chose to the players just chose to play that thing, you can, and it just runs from end to end. And so, yeah, the process is working out. I know that we've got as far as there's a point where the players choose whether they want to go into the past, stay in the present, or move into the future. And each of those have got obviously like then different storytelling textures in terms of the layering of what you kind of perceive the space around you as. So it's just, yeah, pushing on with developing that audio strand whilst also trying not to, be like, and there's also this, and it's like one thing at a time, please, one thing at a time. Yeah, broadly.
Anybody else? I'm going to ask a question then, if nobody else does. So you talked a bit about like the choose your own adventure thing and like, cheating by flicking through the pages and so on, and you talked about like people, almost rejecting the choices and stepping outside of the narrative. And how much of difference do you feel like there is between someone who's like cheating but still engaging with the thing and someone who's just decided to reject the whole thing?
To just opt out. That's a really interesting question. What do I think? The difference between the two. I suppose there's a part in my mind that's about like in creating like if we're imagining that the kind of the narrative, certainly for the first half of the game, does follow that choose your own adventure structure, there is always the option that's like you're allowed to not engage with this thing. And I think a lot of it for me is like permission. Like I think you'd have to wander quite far away from being in the space at all in order to be the person being like, I'm not engaging. It's like you take the headset off and you go home. Yeah. And I think that there is something about, I was about to say something that I actually don't agree with, so I'm just going to pause for a second and think to the end of the sentence. I think the pushing against something, like you said, the like just flipping through the pages but still engaging with it, I think that there's something about that friction with it that is really interesting. And I think that if the game is about the agency of the player, the game is about the collective building of a story, I think it sort of almost frustrates the audience desire to break or complicate something, because it goes, yeah, you're supposed to do that. Congratulations on playing the game. And they're like, no, that's not what I meant. What I meant was, and it's like, congratulations, you're correctly playing the game. If everyone goes, we've decided we're actually all going to go and get a pizza, but we're going to keep our headsets on, it's like, you're still playing the game. I think that's funny. Maybe it's impossible to build. That might be like literally impossible to build, but I do think it is funny to try and think about how you might make a game that can tolerate that amount of stress. I don't know. That's my quick answer.
Great. Any last questions from the room?
Yeah, it's a super cool idea. And I was thinking, because you kind of using nature, the game could be one thing in the summer and completely different in winter.
Yeah.
Or if it's raining and
Yeah, it's something that we talked a lot about after the first sharing, where we were thinking about this choose your own adventure like prologue as a jumping off point, and what people would want if they were going to go, great, I've played that and now I'm coming to the forest to actually play the game proper. We talked about like it telling you what to bring, and it kind of being like the weather's maybe going to be bad, so if you bring these things, or if you don't have them, we'll provide them, or whatever, and just being like the game is played in every condition. Like when people go and see like open air theatre, it's like if you're not going to come because it rains, then it's a skill issue. That's your problem, that's not ours. And I think there's something really fun about it not being predicated on like perfect conditions, because there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. So as long as you've got your waterproof trousers and your Mac on, your wellies, you can still have a great time in the woods. Yes.
Have you ever thought about, say you've been working with kids, have you ever thought about doing it with kids and kind of like maybe in the school setting and not letting them know they're about to play the game and see what happens organically?
I haven't thought about that, but that's immediately the only thing I want to do. Just be like, let's go, let's see what happens. There's something about the design of the game and the kind of the hope that it's rooted in quite like tactile and basic technology, that it's not an app, there's nothing that you need to really like read or understand, that it's kind of taught intuitively through doing, that I'm hoping will mean that there is that space for like younger people or people that don't love technology to engage with it, because it is about just like person to person. It's like a button or a dial or things that we kind of implicitly understand. Would love to do it with a bunch of 6-year-olds and just see what they do. Yeah.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I think we're going to say thank you to Ali.
Thank you.
All right. Before you all go, please don't forget, if you are age 18 to 30 and want to do some weird stuff with tech, check out Makeshift Camp. Details are all on the studio website. It's going to be exciting. If you want to stick around in Hot Desk today or find out more about what we do, then please find one of the studio team. We'll be happy to help. Studio team, give us a wave. It is me and Tony. There's others. They're around somewhere. If you're watching online, you can drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions. Thank you all for being here today, and we'll see you all again next time.
Bye.